powerfulness, positivity, and happiness. However, with closer examination, this same idea of love can take a turn for the worse and poses an extreme detriment to one's strength and independence. Love is always supposed to be a good thing, right? Wrong. Typically, the idea of love in ancient Roman times correlates with thoughts of weakness and the susceptibility to downfall. Specifically, this rings true for women in Virgil's Aeneid. In Latin 4, we have been delving into this text, which is an epic of a man named Aeneas and of his journey with his fellow Trojan comrades as they seek refuge when their beloved city was destroyed. Along this journey, he encounters a copious amount of women, all in which over time become weak and experience a downfall. Gareth Morgan, in his scholarly article Dido the Wounded Deer, thus explores this concept and theme of women being portrayed as weak and experiencing downfalls, specifically through the character of Dido, who is one of the many women Aeneas has relations with. This difference between society's view on love now, as opposed to the ancient Romans' classic view, is thus critical in understanding the way in which Virgil depicts love as a downfall that specifically targets women, and not men, ultimately leaving those women in an extremely vulnerable state. Within Dido the Wounded Deer, by Gareth Morgan, Morgan analyzes the doe simile, a simile in which compares Dido to a deer who has been shot with an arrow by an unknowing hunter who ultimately leaves her defenseless. As Morgan begins his article, he discusses how symbolically Dido's love has proven to be a wound, and that has continued to hinder her from the beginning, as Virgil stated, vulnus allet venus, within the Aeneid. Everything about Aeneas, whether it be the memory of his face, or even the way he sounds when he speaks, remains engraved in her soul and pierces through her heart like an arrow. In the context of Dido and Aeneas' relationship, the love is mutual. However, the love does not wound Aeneas in the same manner that it does Dido, as he is able to move on and fulfill his fate of finding the soon-to-be Roman city. On the other hand, Dido nourishes this love to the point where it begins to engulf her entire being, which ultimately leaves the once strong, independent, and regal queen vulnerable, impotent, and susceptible to tragic downfalls. Ultimately, what this says about Virgil's belief on the downfalls experienced by women is that love only harms women and makes them weak, while to men it has no effect on their well-being. This relates to my argument about the Aeneid, as I am exploring the ways in which Virgil depicts the downfalls of women and how it usually relates to their femininity, posing as a symbol for weakness and vulnerability. In addition, there is a ton of information occurring in the doe simile that needs to be closely read in order to understand the simile's importance. For one, it is extremely apparent that Aeneas is entirely oblivious to what his presence does to Dido and the effect he has on her life. This relates back to my greater argument about the Aeneid, as it highlights Virgil's view that a woman's femininity is ultimately what leaves her open to both tragedy and impotence. Once again, this love has no effect on Aeneas nor his destiny, and does not make him weak or lose his valued character traits as it does Dido, as she completely loses herself and what she stands for. Furthermore, Virgil's belief on the topic of womanly downfalls in this specific source highlights that he thinks love affects women in a negative way and poses as an impediment that makes them vulnerable, while for men, love does not pose as an obstacle, but rather something that has hardly any effect on their life, which relates to my essay argument because both have to do with elements of femininity resulting in vulnerability. Some may argue that Virgil wants us to believe that love did not merely affect Dido but also Aeneas, because his love for her delayed him in accomplishing his fate. In actuality, Aeneas' love for Dido did not pose as a hindrance, because in the end, when he learned that many people hated her and wanted to harm her, he didn't return and he still accomplished his fate. Dido, on the other hand, was characterized as Infelix Dido, when she met Aeneas and fell in love with him. Infelix is directly translated as unhappy and unlucky, thus foreshadowing Dido's life and fate that she was meant to succumb to a specific downfall. In this case, it was her love for Aeneas. This relates back to my greater argument about the Aeneid once more, because the characterization of Dido being doomed from the start and unlucky proves how just being a woman exposes her to a variety of downfalls due to their vulnerability. In the end, Aeneas still remained powerful and a pious leader, even after being in love with Dido, while Dido's love drove her into complete madness that ultimately led to her suicide, with Aeneas' chosen sword that was given to her as a gift. This suicide with Aeneas' sword ultimately highlights how Aeneas' love is the ultimate cause of her downfall, all while having no effect on Aeneas whatsoever. In summation, Morgan analyzes the doe simile in such a manner that highlights that Dido's love poses as a wound to her entire well-being, all while having hardly any detrimental effect on Aeneas in his scholarly article, Dido the Wounded Deer. Dido's love for Aeneas ultimately changed her from being one who was entirely independent, powerful, and a regal queen, to one who now needed the assistance of a man due to her impotence, which led to her death. Aeneas' love for Dido, contrarily, had no effect on him, thus highlighting that Virgil's belief when it comes to womanly downfalls is that love is something that harms women and ultimately leaves them open to succumbing to vulnerability. Last but not least, this relates back to my greater argument, as this source aids in highlighting how femininity for women causes them to experience tragic downfalls due to their vulnerability. Thank you for your time.